I wrote this song on an airport piano.
I've been a fan of Tim Minchin's work for a very long time. When I was 9 I went to go see Matilda, and when I was 14 during a walk around Portmeirion I listened to his So Fucking Rock album for the first time. And while writing this I've just gone to go see his Back show in cinemas.
Show's called Back! From the point of view of my children, I'm back to being an absent father.
So when I found out that we were making a video essay about documentaries and Tim had a documentary released about him days prior, I knew what I had to do. The documentary follows Tim, his family and friends before and up to the Matilda UK premiere, looking back on his life and his rise to fame. It's an expository documentary comprised of interviews as its A-roll and home videos, photos, film performances and actuality footage as its B-roll. The documentary opens with some actuality footage of Tim and his wife getting ready for the Matilda premiere in London, with a section of an interview of Tim under it. In the interview he's talking about what fame does to you and how it's not good for you, which contrasts the film premiere setting perfectly, since he was a big name at the premiere as the songwriter. This immediately humbles Tim in the audience's mind, and anyone who's a fan of his work will believe that this documentary is authentic, as fame and its trappings is something that Tim talks about in interviews and during his shows. One of the things that the documentary talks about is the change of Tim's onstage persona as he grew more and more famous, which keeps Tim humble and a good man in the audience's eyes, even after talking about how famous he is now. This effect is used through his sister talking about the morality of his work and how he shifted and changed his work to reflect his status and the times. The editor frequently uses clips from Tim's live shows and performances without the sync underneath. This means work referenced or talked about is shown, and the audience becomes more familiar with Tim's history and back catalogue of work. During some of the interviews there are multiple cameras recording, which means in the edit if they don't want B-roll on a section they can keep audience retention by flicking between cameras, which will keep the audience engaged. Much like a fictional story, this documentary has different acts and different subjects for those acts. The first 5 minutes, which is what we've just looked at, sets Tim up in the way they want the audience to think of him, and after that it dives into his history. During the beginning of this section, they talk about their background, as while they were middle class, their father tried to raise them as humble as possible. We also learn that all of the Minchin household were musical, and Tim and his sister talk about how drawn he was to the piano, but how he played around with a lot of instruments, and as he said,
I was always drawn to the piano, mostly because I didn't like studying, and so I sort of figured out what chords were, and I learned a bit of guitar, and I just worked it out. I mean, it's not actually that hard, really. I didn't think one day I'm going to be a star. It just wasn't in my culture. It's not how we were brought up.
When talking about Tim's childhood and early career, the B-roll is mostly comprised of images, but you'll see some video footage from the documentary Rock and Roll Nerd and a clip from an ABC segment on Tim from before he was famous. During the different acts of the documentary, they introduced different interviewees who were part of his life at the time, and as they start to talk about his later teen years and university, they're also bringing in more people. People like Eddie Perfect, who's a well-known Australian singer-songwriter who's also written music for musicals. For example, Beetlejuice.
So just relax, you'll be fine. Drink your $50 wine and take a breath. Welcome to a show about death.
And Tim's friend Rhian Skirving, who's a filmmaker who made both Rock and Roll Nerd and Matilda and Me, the two formerly made documentaries about Tim. As they go further into the documentary, they introduce different interviews with Tim going about his daily life, like in his car driving around, or in his house showing off his piano. These interview segments start to appear after they show him performing in an arena and talking about the trappings of fame. This contrast reinstates the point that while Tim is famous, he is just a guy. The rest of the documentary catches us up with Tim from his lucky start at the Melbourne Comedy Festival to present day. But the format of the documentary doesn't really change, so I'll just skip over that. Overall, I think this is a good documentary that's taught me a lot about Tim's history and has introduced me to some things he's done that I wasn't aware of. So them exploring Tim's history and work was successful.